What happens when the man you've been mocking turns out to be your boss? This team found out in the most humbling way. It was one of those mornings that didn't give away any signs of the chaos ahead. The sun was bright over downtown Dallas, and the streets buzzed with activity as people hustled through their day. Among them was a man named Elijah, a delivery driver who had seen it all. Elijah wasn't flashy or loud, but there was a quiet dignity about him that spoke volumes. This particular morning, he had an important delivery to make, one that required him to head to one of the fanciest restaurants in the city, Bellandria's Fine Dining. Known for its high-end clientele and pretentious reputation, it wasn't the type of place Elijah usually lingered in, but today, duty called. His truck rumbled into the back alley of the restaurant, where deliveries were typically dropped off. The place had an air of exclusivity, even in the loading area. Large silver doors marked staff only stood tall, almost daring anyone who didn't belong to step through. Elijah grabbed the invoice clipboard, slid his gloves on, and carefully stacked the boxes of organic produce and specialty seafood onto his dolly. As he wheeled the load toward the entrance, he heard faint laughter from inside. It was the kind of laughter that made your chest tighten, a mixture of ridicule and superiority. Elijah shook his head lightly. He was no stranger to being underestimated or judged, but he wasn't about to let it rattle him. He knocked twice on the steel door and waited. When it opened, a young man in a crisp white chef's jacket stared at him like he was some kind of inconvenience. Behind him, two other staff members peeked out, one stifling a chuckle and the other rolling her eyes. "Deliveries are supposed to come earlier," the young man snapped, his tone dripping with annoyance. Elijah calmly held up the invoice. "I'm right on schedule, sir. Fresh seafood from Gulf Coast Imports and the organic greens you requested." The chef waved him off. "Whatever. Just bring it in and don't block the kitchen entrance." As Elijah pushed his dolly inside, he noticed more staff turning their heads to glance at him, their expressions ranging from amused to condescending. Someone muttered under their breath, "Guess the company sends just anyone to places like this." It wasn't just the words. It was the tone, that mocking, dismissive tone that said more than any insult could. Elijah kept moving, unloading the boxes carefully, his hands steady even though their words lingered in the air like a bad smell. But Elijah didn't flinch. Not yet. He knew something they didn't, and it was only a matter of time before everything changed. As Elijah maneuvered the dolly deeper into the restaurant, he couldn't help but take in the surroundings. Bellandria's Fine Dining was as extravagant as the rumors claimed. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a golden glow on marble floors so polished you could see your reflection. The open kitchen gleamed with stainless steel appliances, and every corner of the place screamed wealth. But beneath the pristine surface was something far less polished. Elijah noticed the way the staff moved, quick and efficient, yes, but with an air of self-importance that didn't sit right. These weren't people proud of their work. They were proud of their hierarchy, and right now, Elijah was at the bottom of it. "Make sure you're not blocking the chef's station," barked a woman wearing a sharp black suit. She didn't even look up from her clipboard as she walked by. "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied, his tone polite but firm. He didn't mind following instructions, but he could feel her gaze linger, scrutinizing him as if she were searching for a reason to dismiss him entirely. Nearby, two waiters stood at the edge of the dining area, folding napkins and whispering. It didn't take a detective to figure out they were talking about him. Every now and then, they'd glance his way, barely hiding their smirks. "What do you think?" "5 minutes before he messes something up," one of them said, snickering. Elijah ignored them and continued with his work. Years in this business had taught him that people like this weren't worth his energy. He focused on unloading the boxes neatly onto the counter by the walk-in fridge. Still, the comments kept coming. "You'd think someone delivering to a place like this would at least dress better," another voice chimed in. Elijah glanced at his uniform. It was clean and pressed, practical for someone hauling boxes all day, but to these people, it wasn't good enough. It didn't matter. He wasn't here to impress anyone. As he finished the first load and turned to head back to the truck, he passed by a group of line cooks near the grill. They, too, paused their chatter to take a long look at him. One of them, a tall man with a smirk that practically screamed trouble, leaned over and whispered loudly enough for Elijah to hear, "Bet he couldn't even afford to eat here, let alone step through the front door." The others laughed, and Elijah felt his jaw tighten slightly. He had plenty of practice letting things slide, but this was starting to push the limits. Still, he kept his composure and made his way back outside for the next load. But the worst was yet to come. Inside, the mocking laughter grew louder, and Elijah could feel their eyes on him like he was some sort of spectacle. He returned to his truck, loading the second set of boxes onto his dolly. The morning heat was creeping in, and the sweat on his brow mixed with the dust from the alley. But as he pushed the dolly back toward the kitchen doors, he could still hear the faint laughter echoing from inside. They hadn't even tried to lower their voices. When he re-entered the kitchen, the head chef, a sharp-featured man named Damien, stood by the counter inspecting the ingredients Elijah had already delivered. He turned his nose up slightly as he picked up a crate of seafood. "Is this the best they could send?" Damien muttered, just loud enough for Elijah to hear. Elijah paused for a moment. "If there's an issue with the quality, I can call the supplier," and Damien cut him off with a dismissive wave. No. Just drop it off and leave. We've got more important things to focus on." As Elijah began unloading the second batch of boxes, he couldn't help but notice the way Damien carried himself. The chef spoke loudly, directing his staff with an exaggerated authority, as if he needed everyone in the room to know he was in charge. "I swear," Damien said, turning to one of the servers, "the standards are dropping everywhere. Look at this guy. Do they not teach professionalism to delivery drivers anymore?" The server, a young woman with a forced smile, glanced at Elijah but didn't say anything. Instead, she nodded at Damien and busied herself setting up the nearby dining area. Elijah kept his head down and finished unloading. He wasn't about to let their words get to him, but he couldn't ignore the growing irritation. It wasn't just the comments, it was the blatant lack of respect, the assumption that he was less than simply because of his job. As he moved to stack the empty crates, one of the kitchen staff called out to him. "Hey, delivery guy, you missed a box." Elijah turned, confused, because he was certain he hadn't. The staff member pointed to a crate sitting near the door, smirking. As he walked over and bent down to pick it up, he realized it was empty. Another round of laughter rippled through the kitchen. "Just messing with you, man," the guy said, slapping his knee. "Relax a little." Elijah didn't respond. Instead, he placed the empty crate back down and finished his work without another word. Inside, his patience was wearing thin, but he reminded himself of why he was here. He had a job to do and a point to make, even if they didn't know it yet. When the delivery was finally complete, Elijah handed the signed invoice to Damien. The chef didn't even look at him as he scrawled his signature across the paper. "You can go now," Damien said curtly, not bothering with a thank you. Elijah paused for a moment, his eyes steady. "Have a good day," he said evenly before turning and heading back to his truck. But just as he reached the door, one of the waiters muttered under his breath, "Yeah, go back to wherever you came from." That was it. Elijah stopped in his tracks. His hand resting on the door handle for a brief moment. The room fell silent. All eyes were on him. He turned slowly, his gaze meeting the waiter's. There was no anger in his expression, just a calm confidence that immediately silenced the smirks and whispers. "I came here," Elijah said, his voice steady, "to deliver something you clearly need more of. Respect." The room stayed quiet as Elijah walked out, but the real surprise was still waiting. It was only a matter of time before they realized who he really was. Elijah leaned against the side of his truck, taking a moment to catch his breath. The delivery was done, but the weight of the morning lingered. He'd been in similar situations countless times, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the way they all seemed so comfortable in their assumptions, so blind to the possibility that he was more than what they saw. He glanced at the restaurant's grand facade, the name Bellandria's etched in elegant gold letters above the entrance. It was surreal, really. Just a few weeks ago, he had signed the final papers that made him the owner of this place. A bold step in his growing empire of fine dining establishments. Elijah's journey to this moment wasn't one of privilege or shortcuts. It was built on years of sweat, sacrifice, and relentless drive. He grew up in a small town in Louisiana, where opportunities were scarce and expectations for someone like him were even scarcer. His parents worked tirelessly, instilling in him the value of hard work and integrity. He had started as a dishwasher in a local diner when he was just 16. Back then, he'd watched the cooks and servers with fascination, dreaming of the day he could create something bigger, something extraordinary. Over the years, he climbed the ladder, moving from kitchen staff to manager, and eventually, he saved enough to open his first restaurant. It wasn't flashy, but it was his, and from there, his vision only grew. When the opportunity to buy Bellandria's came up, Elijah didn't hesitate. He knew it was a risk, but he also knew what this place could become under his leadership. The restaurant had a reputation for exclusivity, but Elijah saw potential beyond the surface. He wanted to turn it into something more, an establishment where everyone felt valued, from the guests to the staff to the people making deliveries. But the transition wasn't going to be easy. Elijah had chosen not to announce his ownership immediately, opting instead to observe the culture firsthand. He wanted to see how the staff operated when they thought no one was watching. What he saw this morning only confirmed what he suspected. Change was long overdue. He climbed back into his truck and made a few notes on his tablet, preparing for the meeting he had scheduled with the staff later that afternoon. He had kept the announcement of his arrival vague, telling the manager to gather everyone in the dining room at 3 p.m. He thought about Chef Damien and the way he carried himself, how quick he was to judge and dismiss. He thought about the waiters, the kitchen staff, and the manager who barely acknowledged him. Elijah didn't feel anger toward them. He felt something deeper. A sense of disappointment in how easily people fell into patterns of prejudice and disrespect. By the time he drove away from the restaurant, Elijah had made up his mind. The meeting wouldn't just be about an introduction. It would be about setting the tone for what Bellandria's would stand for moving forward. Respect, humility, and equality weren't just buzzwords to him. They were the foundation of everything he believed in. And in a few short hours, they were about to find out exactly who Elijah was and why he was there. The clock struck 3 p.m., and the staff began to gather in the main dining room of Bellandria's fine dining. Some looked curious, others annoyed. Damien leaned against a table, arms crossed, his expression a mixture of irritation and boredom. "What's this about?" he muttered to one of the servers. "We're slammed tonight, and now we have to sit through a meeting?" The restaurant manager, a middle-aged man named Greg, stood near the entrance, looking unusually nervous. He had been told to assemble everyone, but even he didn't know exactly why. All he had been told was that the new owner would be arriving today and that this meeting was mandatory. As the staff settled in, the doors to the dining room opened, and in walked Elijah, still dressed in the same uniform he'd worn that morning. For a moment, the room was silent, the staff exchanging confused glances. Damien let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. Elijah walked to the center of the room, his calm demeanor unchanged. He could feel the tension, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. But he didn't rush to explain. Instead, he let the silence linger for a few moments, meeting their gazes one by one. Finally, Greg cleared his throat, breaking the awkward quiet. Elijah, what are you doing here?" "This meeting is for staff only." Elijah smiled faintly, his voice steady but firm. "I know, Greg. That's why I'm here." Damien rolled his eyes. "Look, if this is about the delivery earlier, can we just move on? We have actual work to do." Elijah turned his attention to Damien, his gaze steady. "You're right, Chef Damien. This is about the delivery. And it's about a lot more than that." Damien raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, Elijah continued. "Let me introduce myself properly. My name is Elijah Reynolds, and as of 3 weeks ago, I'm the new owner of Belle Andrea's Fine Dining." The room fell silent again, but this time, the air was thick with shock. Damien's smirk vanished, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. The servers exchanged stunned looks, and Greg's face turned pale. "You?" Damien finally managed to say, his voice almost a whisper. "You're the owner?" "That's right," Elijah said, his tone even. "And before you say anything else, I want you to understand something. This isn't about me flaunting my title or putting anyone in their place. This is about respect." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I spent the morning observing how this team operates. I saw the way you treated me because you assumed I was just a delivery driver. And I want you to think about what that says, not about me, but about you." Damien opened his mouth to respond but quickly shut it again. The servers looked down at the floor, suddenly finding their shoes fascinating. Elijah continued, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "You judged me before you even knew who I was. You made assumptions based on how I looked, what I was wearing, and the job I was doing. And that behavior? It doesn't just hurt me. It hurts this restaurant. It hurts the culture we're trying to build here." The room stayed silent as Elijah's words hung in the air. He looked around, meeting their eyes again. "Every person who walks through these doors deserves respect. Whether they're a guest, a staff member, or someone delivering the ingredients that keep this place running. That's the standard I expect from every single one of you." For the first time that day, Elijah saw something new in their expressions: shame. And as uncomfortable as it was for them, it was exactly what they needed to feel. The silence in the room was almost palpable, every staff member grappling with the weight of Elijah's words. Damien shifted uncomfortably, his arms no longer crossed in defiance but hanging awkwardly by his sides. The servers avoided eye contact, their earlier smirks now long gone. Elijah took a step forward, his tone softening but losing none of its authority. "I know change doesn't happen overnight. But if this restaurant is going to succeed, it starts with how we treat each other. It starts with accountability and respect for everyone." He paused, scanning the room to make sure his message landed. "I didn't start at the top," he said. "I've been where you are. Working long hours, doing the jobs no one notices. I've scrubbed floors, washed dishes, carried boxes just like I did this morning. And let me tell you, those roles are just as important as any chef or manager in this room. Without them, this place doesn't run." The staff remained silent, the gravity of his journey hitting them harder than any reprimand could. Elijah let the moment settle before continuing. "So here's what's going to happen. Starting today, we're building a new culture here. One where every role is respected. Where assumptions and judgments have no place. And if anyone thinks they can't be part of that, this isn't the right team for you." His words were met with quiet nods, some staff members murmuring apologies under their breath. Damien finally spoke up, his voice hesitant. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. Elijah held up a hand to stop him. "Actions speak louder than words, chef. If you're willing to do better, then prove it. Show me and the rest of the team that you're here to grow. That goes for everyone." He stepped back, his calm demeanor returning. "We all have biases. We all make mistakes. But what matters is how we move forward. And I believe this team can be better." With that, Elijah turned to leave the room, but not before offering one final statement. "Remember, respect costs nothing. But its absence can cost you everything." The staff sat in silence long after Elijah walked out, the weight of his message pressing down on them. And for the first time in years, Bellandria's fine dining felt like it might finally live up to its name. This story isn't just about a restaurant. It's about all of us. How often do we make assumptions about someone without knowing their story? How often do we let pride or prejudice cloud our judgment? Let's do better. Whether it's in our workplaces, our communities, or even in our daily interactions, respect and kindness don't just change lives. They build bridges. The staff remained silent, the weight of Elijah's words settling in their minds. Some shifted uncomfortably, others looked at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. The smug expressions, the condescending glances, and the quiet laughter that had filled the kitchen earlier had disappeared. In their place was the undeniable realization that they had misjudged him, that their assumptions had exposed something ugly within themselves. Elijah let the silence stretch for a few moments longer, allowing the discomfort to do its work. He knew that real change didn't come from lectures or threats. It came from moments like this, moments that forced people to confront the truth about themselves. Finally, Damien cleared his throat, rubbing the back of his neck as if trying to gather his thoughts. I didn't mean anything by it, he mumbled, his voice lacking its usual authority. It was just. Elijah cut him off with a calm, measured tone. It wasn't just a joke, chef. It was a reflection of how you see people. Of how you see me. He let that sit for a second before continuing. And if you're treating me this way, someone who just walked through these doors, I can only imagine how you treat others when you think no one is watching. A deep unease settled over the group. The waiters who had snickered earlier were now quiet, their faces flushed with embarrassment. One of the line cooks, a younger man who had been part of the laughter, shifted his stance, clearly uncomfortable. Elijah wasn't raising his voice, he wasn't angry, but that only made his words hit harder. I started in this business washing dishes, Elijah continued, his voice steady but firm. I spent years working in kitchens, working my way up, learning the business from the ground up. I've done every job in a restaurant, from scrubbing floors to managing staff. And do you know what I've learned in all those years? He scanned the room, making eye contact with each person, ensuring they were listening. That the way you treat people when you think they're beneath you says everything about who you are. Damien exhaled sharply, clearly struggling with what to say. He was used to being the one in control, the one whose words carried weight. But now, standing in front of Elijah, a man he had dismissed just hours ago, he found himself at a loss. Elijah folded his arms, tilting his head slightly. I'm not here to humiliate anyone, Damien. I'm here to make this place better. And I need to know, are you going to be a part of that, or are you going to be a problem? The question lingered in the air. Damien clenched his jaw, but when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. I want to do better, he admitted. I know I can do better. Elijah gave a small nod. Good. Then prove it. He turned his attention to the rest of the staff. That goes for everyone in this room. I'm not asking for perfection, but I am demanding respect. Not just for me, but for each other. For the dishwashers, the delivery drivers, the servers, the cooks, the guests, everyone. The room remained still, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, one of the waitresses, a woman named Marissa, hesitated before stepping forward slightly. I'm sorry, she said quietly. For the way we acted earlier. It wasn't right. Elijah acknowledged her with a nod. Apology accepted. But don't say it to me, show it in how you treat people from now on. Marissa nodded, and a ripple of understanding seemed to pass through the staff. One by one, they started nodding, murmuring their agreement. Elijah took a deep breath, sensing that the message had landed. This restaurant has the potential to be something great. But it won't happen unless we fix what's broken behind the scenes. That starts today. He let his words hang in the air before finally stepping back. All right. That's all I have to say. Now, let's get back to work. The room remained silent as Elijah turned and walked toward the exit. Just as he reached the door, he heard Damien's voice behind him. Elijah. Elijah paused, glancing over his shoulder. Damien swallowed hard before speaking. Welcome to Bellandria's. Elijah held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. Thank you, chef. As he stepped out of the dining room, the quiet buzz of conversation slowly picked up behind him. The staff had a lot to think about, but Elijah knew that real change wouldn't come from words alone. It would take time, effort, and consistency. But he also knew one thing for sure. Bellandria's fine dining would never be the same again. Elijah stepped into his office, closing the door behind him and letting out a slow breath. He had delivered the message he wanted to, but the real work was only beginning. Changing a culture wasn't as simple as giving a speech and expecting people to behave differently overnight. People resisted change, especially when they were comfortable in their ways, no matter how flawed those ways might be. He walked over to the large window that overlooked the dining area. From here, he could see the staff beginning to disperse, still talking in hushed voices. Some looked shaken, others thoughtful. A few, like Damien, wore unreadable expressions, their pride keeping them from reacting too openly. Elijah wasn't naive. He knew some of them might never fully change, that there would always be people who clung to their prejudices, even if they learned to hide them better. But that wasn't his concern. His concern was making sure that those who wanted to be better had the opportunity to do so. That the restaurant he had just taken over wouldn't be another place where arrogance and entitlement thrived at the expense of respect and teamwork. There was a soft knock on his door. "Come in," he said, turning back toward his desk. The door opened slightly, and Greg, the manager, stepped inside. He looked nervous, shifting on his feet before speaking. Elijah. I mean, Mr. Reynolds, I just wanted to say Elijah is fine, he interrupted smoothly, sitting down in his chair. Greg nodded quickly. Right, Elijah. I just wanted to say that I didn't know you were the new owner. If I had, he hesitated, clearly trying to find the right words. If I had known, I would have handled things differently. Elijah studied him for a moment before responding. That's exactly the problem, Greg. Greg's brow furrowed in confusion. Sir? If you would have treated me differently just because I own this place, then that means you're not treating people the way they deserve to be treated, you're treating them based on their status, Elijah said simply, lacing his fingers together on the desk. That's not the kind of leadership I want here. Greg's face paled slightly. I didn't mean it like that. I was just, I know, Elijah said, cutting him off gently but firmly. I don't think you're a bad person, Greg. I think you've been a part of a system that rewarded people for looking down on others. But that system ends today. Greg swallowed, nodding slowly. I understand. Elijah leaned back slightly. Good. Because I'm not just here to give speeches. I'm here to make sure this place runs the right way. And that starts with you. Greg looked up in surprise. Me? You're the manager. That means the way this restaurant operates is a direct reflection of your leadership. If the staff is treating people with disrespect, it's because they think that's acceptable. And if they think it's acceptable, it's because you've allowed it. Greg opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing that there was no real argument to be made. He had let things slide too many times. The quiet comments, the little snide remarks, the dismissive attitudes toward the lower-ranked employees, he had never actively encouraged it, but he had never stopped it either. And in doing so, he had let it grow into something that had become the norm. What do you need me to do? Greg finally asked. Elijah gave a small nod of approval. First, you need to start holding your team accountable. Every person in that restaurant needs to understand that respect is not optional. I don't care how skilled they are, I don't care how long they've been here. If they can't show basic human decency, they don't belong at Bellandria's. Greg nodded again, his expression serious. Understood. Second, Elijah continued, you need to set the example. That means no more turning a blind eye when someone steps out of line. No more tolerating behavior just because someone is good at their job. If they're toxic to the team, then they're not good for this place. Period. Greg took a deep breath, straightening his posture. I can do that. I know you can, Elijah said. And I'll be watching to make sure it happens. Greg hesitated, then gave a small smile. You're not what I expected. Elijah raised an eyebrow. What did you expect? Greg chuckled awkwardly. I don't know. Some rich investor who sits in an office and doesn't really care what happens on the floor. Elijah smirked. Well, you've got the wrong guy. I built my career from the ground up. And I didn't come here to sit in an office, I came here to make a difference. Greg's smile grew a little more genuine. I think you already have. Elijah stood, extending his hand. Greg took it without hesitation, shaking it firmly. Let's get to work, Elijah said. Greg nodded and turned to leave. As the door closed behind him, Elijah exhaled slowly. That had gone better than expected. Greg seemed willing to adapt, which meant there was a good chance the rest of the team would follow. Elijah glanced at the clock. The dinner service would begin in a few hours, and he was curious to see how the staff handled themselves after today's wake-up call. He had no illusions that everything would change instantly, but he was confident that the seed had been planted. He picked up his tablet, scrolling through the restaurant's financial reports. There was still so much to do. Menu adjustments, operational changes, marketing strategies, but none of it would matter if the foundation of the restaurant wasn't solid. And that foundation started with the people. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. This time, when it opened, it was Marissa, the waitress who had apologized earlier. She stepped in hesitantly, clasping her hands in front of her. Hey, she said softly. I just wanted to say something. Elijah set the tablet down, giving her his full attention. Go ahead. Marissa took a breath. I wasn't raised to look down on people. My mom always taught me to treat everyone with kindness, but, working here, I guess I got caught up in the way things were. It just became normal to act like we were better than certain people. She looked down at her hands. That's not who I want to be. Elijah studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. Then don't be. Marissa looked up, surprised. Just like that? Elijah leaned forward. We all make mistakes, Marissa. What matters is that we recognize them and do better. You can't change what you did yesterday, but you can decide who you're going to be today. She nodded slowly, a flicker of determination in her eyes. I want to be better. Then start with the little things, Elijah said. How you talk to people, how you react to situations, how you support your team. Respect isn't just about the big moments, it's in the details. Marissa exhaled, as if letting go of a weight she had been carrying. Okay. Thank you. Elijah nodded. Thank you for being willing to change. She gave a small smile before turning and leaving the office. Elijah watched the door close behind her and felt something settle inside him. Change was already happening. It wouldn't be immediate. It wouldn't be easy. But it was happening. And that was enough for now. Elijah sat back in his chair, letting the silence of the office settle around him. He knew that change wasn't just about one conversation or one powerful moment, it was about consistency. The real test would come in the following days, when the weight of his words faded and old habits tried to creep back in. That was how people worked. They might be shaken by a reality check, but in the end, comfort was a powerful thing, and comfort often made people resistant to change. He stood up and walked to the window again, watching the restaurant floor as the staff slowly returned to their duties. The energy was different now, quieter, more cautious. The usual arrogance and carelessness had been replaced with something else, something uncertain. Some people whispered among themselves, others avoided eye contact entirely. Elijah wasn't worried. He had spent years leading teams, and he understood that discomfort was part of growth. He wasn't expecting them to suddenly become perfect, but he was expecting them to think twice before speaking or acting. That was the first step. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a message from his assistant, reminding him about a meeting scheduled for the following morning. It was with the investors who had partnered with him to acquire Bel Andreas. They would want numbers, projections, and update on operations. What they wouldn't know was the culture shift he was trying to enforce. Investors cared about profits, not workplace dynamics. But Elijah knew that one affected the other. A restaurant with a toxic work environment would never thrive, no matter how good the food was. There was another knock at the door. This time, it was Damien. Elijah didn't say anything, just gestured for him to enter. Damien stepped inside and shut the door behind him. His usual smug expression was gone, replaced by something closer to unease. "Elijah," he started, his tone hesitant. I just wanted to say that I get it now." Elijah leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "What exactly do you get?" Damien sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "That I've been an ass," he admitted. "I got comfortable being in charge. I got comfortable treating people like they were beneath me because that's how things have always worked in high-end restaurants. You either demand respect or you get walked over." Elijah studied him carefully, searching for signs of insincerity. "Respect isn't something you demand, Damien. It's something you earn." Damien let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah. I see that now." He shifted his weight, glancing toward the floor before meeting Elijah's gaze again. "I won't lie to you, I'm not used to this. I came up in kitchens where screaming at staff was normal, or breaking someone down was just how you toughen them up. No one ever cared about feelings, or respect, or any of that." Elijah nodded slowly. "I know. I've worked in places like that, too." Damien took a deep breath. "But you're right. It's toxic. It doesn't make people better, it just makes them bitter. And I don't want to be that kind of leader anymore." Elijah let the silence stretch for a few moments before responding. "Then show me. Show your team. Words mean nothing if your actions don't back them up." Damien straightened his posture. "I will." Elijah pushed off the desk and extended a hand. "Then let's move forward." Damien hesitated for a second before shaking it. His grip was firm, and for the first time that day, his expression wasn't one of resistance, it was one of determination. After Damien left, Elijah sat back down, letting out a slow breath. That had been unexpected. He had hoped Damien would come around, but he hadn't expected it to happen this quickly. Maybe the chef had just needed someone to hold up a mirror to his behavior. Maybe he had been waiting for a reason to change. Either way, it was a step in the right direction. Dinner service began, and Elijah spent the evening watching from the sidelines. He didn't interfere unless necessary, wanting to see how the staff handled themselves now that they knew who he was. There were noticeable differences. The usual arrogance and condescension had been dialed down. Conversations were quieter, less dismissive. Damien, true to his word, was making an effort. He gave clear instructions without his usual sharpness, corrected mistakes without belittling people. It wasn't perfect. There were still lingering habits, small glances exchanged when they thought he wasn't looking, stiff politeness that hadn't yet turned into genuine respect. But the difference between today and this morning was undeniable. Elijah knew it was just the beginning. He walked through the kitchen, nodding to the cooks, acknowledging their work. A few of them looked surprised but quickly nodded back. Marissa was refilling a water pitcher when she caught his eye. She hesitated for a moment before offering a small, genuine smile. Elijah returned it. Progress. He knew there was still work to be done. There would be moments of backsliding, resistance from people who preferred things the way they were. But he was ready for that. He had built his entire career overcoming obstacles. And this? This was just another challenge. As the night progressed, Elijah continued observing, taking note of the subtle changes in the way people interacted. While the shift wasn't drastic, there was progress. No more mocking laughter behind anyone's back. No more dismissive glares. Even Damien, who had spent years leading with an iron fist, seemed to be making an effort. He still had his sharp edge, but there was restraint in his tone, and awareness that hadn't been there before. Elijah walked through the dining area, discreetly listening to how the servers spoke to guests. Their professionalism had always been top tier, but now he was paying attention to something deeper. Were they treating all customers with the same level of respect? Or were they still holding on to their biases, the same ones that had allowed them to judge him when he had walked in as a delivery driver? He caught snippets of conversations, watching body language, noting who still had an air of arrogance and who was genuinely adjusting. It would take time, but that was fine. Elijah wasn't the kind of leader who expected miracles overnight. He believed in setting a standard and enforcing it every single day until it became the new normal. As he moved through the restaurant, he spotted Greg near the host stand, straightening menus and checking reservations. Their eyes met, and Greg nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the conversation they'd had earlier. Elijah nodded back. Just as he was about to step into the kitchen again, he heard a quiet voice behind him. "Excuse me, sir?" Elijah turned to find an older woman standing near a table, her hands clasped together politely. She had a warm but slightly hesitant expression. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I just wanted to say. I saw what happened earlier today," she said. "I was sitting by the window when you made your first delivery." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" She smiled knowingly. It's funny how people reveal who they really are when they think no one important is watching. Elijah let out a short chuckle. "You're right about that." The woman nodded. "The way you handled it, that was something special. Most people would have gotten angry or humiliated them in front of everyone. But you let them dig their own hole, and then you gave them a chance to climb out of it." "I don't believe in shaming people into change," Elijah said simply. "I believe in making them see why change is necessary." The woman smiled. "That's rare. And it's exactly what this world needs more of." Elijah inclined his head slightly. "Thank you." She gave him one last approving nod before returning to her table, leaving Elijah with her words lingering in his mind. By the end of the night, the staff was moving more efficiently than before, but there was still an underlying nervousness. They were hyper-aware of his presence, watching their words, correcting themselves mid-sentence. It wasn't exactly what he wanted. He didn't need them to be afraid of him. He needed them to respect the values he was putting in place. As the final guests finished their meals and the restaurant began winding down for the night, Elijah stepped into the kitchen. The atmosphere was different now, still busy, still filled with the usual exhaustion of a long shift, but not as tense as before. "Everyone, listen up," he called out, and the kitchen staff turned to him. Today was a start. Not perfect, but a start. Some exchanged glances, unsure of whether that was meant as praise or a warning. Elijah continued. "I saw effort from some of you, and I appreciate that. But let me make something clear, I'm not here for temporary adjustments. I don't want you on your best behavior just because I'm watching. I want this to become who you are, whether I'm in the room or not. The kitchen was silent except for the distant sound of dishes being stacked in the back. You'll either adapt to the new culture of this restaurant, Elijah said, his tone calm but firm, or you won't be here. It's that simple. He let that sit for a moment before giving a short nod. Good work tonight. Get some rest. As he turned to leave, Damien called out, Chef. Elijah glanced over his shoulder. Damien hesitated, then gave a short nod. See you tomorrow. It was a small thing, but coming from Damien, it carried weight. Elijah smiled slightly. See you tomorrow. As he left the kitchen, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to be easy. But nothing worth building ever was. The next morning, Elijah arrived at Bel Andrea's earlier than usual. The city was just waking up, and the restaurant, still quiet, felt like a blank slate. The air carried the faint scent of last night's service, the lingering spices, and the warmth of a well-used kitchen. Today was a new day, and Elijah was eager to see if the lessons from yesterday had left a lasting impression. He made his way to his office, checking the schedule for the day. There were no major events, just another regular service. But for Elijah, no day was just another day. Every shift was an opportunity to test the progress they were making, to see who was adapting and who was still resisting. He wasn't just looking for improved behavior when he was present, he wanted to hear from customers, from suppliers, from lower-ranked staff, about whether the environment had truly shifted. As he glanced over reports from the past week, there was a knock at his door. Come in, he said. Greg stepped inside, looking more confident than the day before. Morning, Elijah. Morning, Greg, Elijah said, setting his tablet down. What's on your mind? Greg exhaled, running a hand over the back of his neck. I wanted to let you know that I spoke with the staff this morning. We had a quick team meeting before opening. Elijah raised an eyebrow. And? Greg hesitated for only a second before nodding. I told them that things are changing, that the way we treated people before isn't going to fly anymore. Some of them still look a little uncomfortable. But they're listening. Elijah studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. Keep pushing it. If people feel uncomfortable, that means they're realizing something was wrong in the first place. Greg gave a small chuckle. Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening. Elijah leaned forward. And Damien? Greg smirked slightly. Believe it or not, he actually backed me up. He told them they needed to act like professionals, that respect in this kitchen isn't optional. Elijah allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. Damien was a work in progress, but the fact that he was already reinforcing the message meant something. That's a start, Elijah said. Let's see if it lasts. Greg nodded. I'll keep you updated. After Greg left, Elijah decided to take a walk through the restaurant before service began. The waitstaff was preparing their stations, making sure everything was polished and perfect. There was a quiet focus in the air, a different energy than before. He spotted Marissa wiping down a table, her movements quick and precise. When she saw him, she gave a small smile. It wasn't the hesitant smile from the day before, it was a real one. Good morning, sir, she said. Elijah, he corrected gently. She nodded. Good morning, Elijah. He glanced around. How's the team today? She hesitated for only a second. Better. Still adjusting, but better. Elijah appreciated her honesty. That's all I ask. Keep an eye on things, and if you see someone slipping back into old habits, call them out on it. Marissa looked a little surprised but then nodded firmly. I will. As Elijah continued his rounds, he noticed something else: people were greeting him now. Not just nods, not just the forced politeness of an employee acknowledging their boss, but actual greetings. Small gestures, but meaningful. The biggest surprise came when he walked into the kitchen. Damien was at his station, preparing ingredients, his usual intense focus on display. But as Elijah entered, he didn't just ignore him as he usually might have. Instead, Damien straightened slightly and gave a curt nod. "Morning, chef," he said. Elijah's eyebrows lifted slightly. Chef. It was a title he had earned years ago, but this was the first time Damien had acknowledged it. "Morning, Damien," Elijah replied. And just like that, he knew they were making progress. As the kitchen came to life, Elijah remained in the background, watching how the team operated now that they knew he was here to stay. The morning prep was moving along efficiently, but there was a different energy in the air, not fear, not tension, but awareness. The staff had realized that how they behaved mattered, not just when customers were watching, but in every moment of their work. He noticed Damien working with the line cooks, his usual sharpness still present, but something had changed. Instead of barking orders and making passive-aggressive remarks, he was guiding them, offering precise instructions without condescension. There was still an edge to his tone, but it was no longer laced with arrogance. Elijah watched as one of the younger cooks fumbled slightly while plating an appetizer. In the past, Damien might have rolled his eyes or muttered a sarcastic comment under his breath. Instead, he reached over, adjusted the garnish, and said, like this: "Make sure every plate looks the same before it leaves the kitchen." The young cook nodded quickly. "Yes, chef." Elijah didn't say anything, but he stored the moment away. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a step in the right direction. After a few minutes, Damien glanced in Elijah's direction. "You just going to stand there all day, or are you actually here to work?" Elijah smirked slightly. "You'd be surprised how much you can learn just by watching." Damien scoffed but didn't argue. Instead, he turned back to his station and got back to work. As service started, Elijah continued to move through the restaurant, observing every detail. The waitstaff was more attentive, not just to guests but to each other. He caught Marissa quietly reminding another server to refill a table's water glasses before the guests had to ask. The small things mattered. Greg moved with more confidence than he had the day before, stepping in where needed, checking on customers, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. The nervous energy from their first meeting had been replaced with something steadier: purpose. By the time the dinner rush hit, the team had settled into a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments where old habits threatened to creep in, but there was progress. And for Elijah, that was enough for now. As the last tables were cleared and the staff began their closing routines, Elijah stood by the bar, watching. Damien finished wiping down his station and walked over, arms crossed. "You satisfied?" he asked. Elijah took a sip of water before answering. "It's a good start." Damien grunted. "I'll take that." He hesitated for a second, then added, "You're not as bad as I thought you'd be." Elijah smirked. "Neither are you." Damien shook his head, muttering something under his breath, but there was no hostility in it. Just the beginnings of respect. As Elijah left the restaurant that night, he knew there was still a long road ahead. There would be setbacks, moments where people slipped back into old patterns. But the foundation was being laid. And that was all he needed. Because change wasn't about one big moment. It was about every small choice, every shift in mindset, every lesson learned. And Bellandria's was finally moving in the right direction. Elijah stepped out into the cool night air, taking a deep breath as he walked toward his car. The city streets were quieter now, the rush of the dinner crowd fading into the late hours. The restaurant's golden sign glowed softly against the dark sky, and for the first time since taking ownership, he felt like it truly belonged to him. He wasn't just running a business, he was reshaping its very core. As he unlocked his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from an unknown number. "Unknown, you're doing something special at Bellandria's. Keep going." Elijah frowned slightly, then typed back. "Elijah, who is this?" The response came quickly. "Unknown, just someone who believes in what you're doing." He stared at the message for a moment before shaking his head with a small smile. Whoever it was, they weren't wrong. The next morning, he arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual, eager to see how things had settled overnight. He walked through the front doors and immediately noticed a difference. The usual stiffness, the careful politeness that had been present since his revelation, was beginning to ease. People were talking to each other not just about work, but in a way that suggested genuine camaraderie. Greg was at the host stand, already flipping through the reservations for the day. He looked up as Elijah approached and gave a small nod. "Morning." "Morning," Elijah replied. "Anything I should know about?" Greg hesitated before speaking. "Actually, yeah. Had a couple of staff members come to me last night after service. They admitted they'd been part of the problem before, that they got caught up in the culture here. They said they want to do better." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "And do you believe them?" Greg nodded. "I do. People make mistakes, but the fact that they're owning up to it without being pushed? That says something." Elijah considered that for a moment before nodding. "Then let's give them a chance." He made his way to the kitchen next, stepping inside just as the first shifts were beginning their prep work. Damien was already there, sleeves rolled up, focused on a sauce he was stirring. When he saw Elijah, he gave a brief nod before returning to his work. One of the line cooks accidentally knocked over a container of herbs, sending fresh rosemary scattering across the counter. Elijah tensed slightly, waiting to see how Damien would react. A week ago, he would have snapped, made a sarcastic remark, and embarrassed the cook in front of everyone. Instead, Damien sighed and handed the cook a towel. "Clean it up and get a fresh batch. Be more careful next time." The cook nodded quickly. "Yes, chef." Elijah smirked. "Look at you. Almost like a leader." Damien rolled his eyes but didn't argue. That, in itself, was progress. As the day went on, Elijah continued watching, making mental notes of who was adapting and who was still resistant. He knew that not everyone would change. Some people would always hold on to their old ways, and eventually, they'd either fall in line or find themselves without a place at Bellandria's. By the time dinner service rolled around, things were running smoother than they had in a long time. The kitchen operated like a well-oiled machine, the front-of-house staff moved with confidence, and for the first time, Elijah could see the restaurant he had envisioned taking shape. But he also knew this was just the beginning. Change wasn't about a single moment, it was about consistency. And he was ready for whatever came next. Elijah stood outside Bellandria's, watching as the last lights inside flickered off for the night. The restaurant was different now, not just in how it ran, but in the energy it carried. The arrogance, the toxic culture, the quiet dismissiveness that had once poisoned its foundation were fading. In their place, something stronger was beginning to take root: respect. He had come here to change a business, but in the process, he had changed people. Not just Damien, not just Greg, not just the staff, but himself, too. He had proven once again that leadership wasn't about power, titles, or wealth. It was about action. As he walked to his car, his phone buzzed again. "Unknown, you did it." Elijah chuckled to himself. He didn't know who was watching, who had been following his journey, but in that moment, it didn't matter. He had done what he came here to do. He looked back at the restaurant one last time before getting into his car. Tomorrow, there would be another challenge, another lesson, another step forward. But for tonight, he allowed himself one quiet moment of victory. With that, he drove off into the city, knowing that Bellandria's, his restaurant, his vision, was finally on the right path. The end.